Jake Martinez stared at the blinking red lights on his control panel and sighed deeply. The navigation system of his cargo ship knew. Dawn had picked the worst possible time to malfunction. He was supposed to deliver a shipment of coffee beans and mining equipment to Station Beta 7, but instead, he found himself drifting toward some massive structure he had never seen before. Captain Lisa Harper floated into the cockpit and looked over his shoulder at the readings. She had been his partner for 3 years now, and Jake trusted her judgment more than anyone else in the galaxy. Lisa was smart, practical, and never panicked. Even when things went wrong, the structure ahead of them was enormous. Beyond enormous, actually, it looked like someone had taken a small moon and carved it into the most beautiful space station Jake had ever seen. Elegant spires twisted upward from the main body, while gentle curves and flowing lines made the whole thing look more like art than architecture. Soft blue and purple lights danced across its surface in patterns that seemed almost alive. Jake pressed the communication button and spoke into his headset. "This is cargo vessel New Dawn, requesting docking permission. We have experienced navigation failure and need assistance." Smooth mechanical voice responded immediately. "Welcome to Harmony Edge Neutral Station. Please proceed to docking bay 12. Your arrival has been logged and announced to all current residents." Lisa raised an eyebrow at Jake and whispered, "Neutral station? What do you think that means?" Jake shrugged as he guided their ship toward the indicated docking bay. Maybe they handled disputes between different companies, or something like business mediation. The docking bay was spotless and clearly designed for ships much larger than theirs. Jake felt a bit embarrassed as his humble cargo vessel settled next to what looked like vessels made of pure crystal, and others that seemed to be grown rather than built. The technology here was far beyond anything he had encountered in human spaces. They walked down the ramp. Jake noticed the air felt different. Not just cleaner, but somehow more alive. There was a faint humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. At once the walls of the station were covered in symbols and patterns that hurt his eyes to look at directly. A floating robot approached them and spoke in the same smooth voice they had heard over the radio. "Greetings, travelers. You have arrived. During a significant diplomatic session, please be aware that movement through certain sections of the station is restricted. Would you like a guide to available facilities?" Jake looked at Lisa, who nodded yes. "Please, we just need directions to find someone who can help us fix our navigation, and maybe grab some food." The robot led them through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. Everything was too big, too grand, and too beautiful. Jake felt like he was walking through a palace or a cathedral. The walls showed moving pictures of stars and planets and creatures he could not identify. They passed other beings in the corridors, and Jake tried not to stare. Some were tall and graceful with pointed ears and flowing robes that seemed to shimmer with their own light. Others were large and covered in what looked like scales or armor, with eyes that glowed in the dim lighting. Everyone moved with purpose and dignity that made Jake feel very ordinary. The robot stopped in front of a large circular door covered in swirling patterns. "Your requested facilities are beyond this portal, however. I must inform you that a formal diplomatic session is currently in progress. Entry may cause disruption to proceedings that have been ongoing for several standard cycles." Jake looked at the door, and then at Lisa. "All we need is someone to point us in the right direction." How disruptive could that be? Robot seemed to consider this for a moment. "Very well, please maintain appropriate decorum and speak only when addressed. The session involves representatives of the Elvari Empire and the Zephyrian Coalition." The door opened with a soft musical sound, and Jake stepped through into the most incredible room he had ever seen. The ceiling stretched up so high it disappeared into shadows, while the walls curved in impossible ways that made his head spin. In the center of the room was a massive oval table made of some kind of glowing stone. Around it sat the most unusual collection of beings Jake had ever imagined. On one side of the table sat creatures that looked like they had stepped out of a fairy tale. They were tall and elegant, with long flowing hair and clothes that seemed to be made of starlight itself. Their skin was pale and perfect, and their eyes held depths that suggested they had seen centuries pass by. Jake realized these must be the Elvari the robot had mentioned. On the other side sat beings that were clearly warriors, large and powerful, with scales that gleamed like armor, and eyes that burned with inner fire. Some had cybernetic implants that pulsed with energy, while others carried weapons that hummed with barely contained power. These had to be the Zephyriansevirn. In the room turned to look at Jake as he entered. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. He suddenly realized he was wearing his everyday work clothes, stained cargo pants and a t-shirt that said "Best Dad in the Galaxy," a gift from his daughter back on Earth 1 of the Elvari. Being stood up slowly. Her movement was so graceful it looked like dancing. She was the most beautiful creature Jake had ever seen, with silver hair that flowed like water and violet eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. Her voice was like music when she spoke. Known, being, you have entered a sacred space of negotiation. State your purpose and allegiance. Jake looked around the room and realized everyone was waiting for his answer. He cleared his throat and spoke the only truth he knew. Hi there, sorry to interrupt, but I think I might be lost. Our navigation system broke down, and we just need some directions. My name is Jake Martinez, and this is my ship Captain Lisa Harper. We are from Earth. The word Earth seemed to cause a stir among both groups. Several beings began speaking at once, in languages Jake could not understand. The beautiful Elvari woman raised her hand for silence, and the room became quiet. Earth is unknown to us. Human is also unknown. What manner of being are you, and what brings you to this sacred convergence? Jake felt Lisa step up beside him for support. He looked around the room again, taking in the serious faces and the obvious importance of whatever was happening here. I am just a cargo hauler. Ma'am, we deliver supplies and equipment to colonies and stations. We are not warriors, or diplomats, or anything important. We just got lost. One of the large Sephorian warriors stood up, and Jake had to crane his neck to see the top of its head. The creature was easily 8 feet tall, with arms like tree trunks, and a voice like rocks grinding together. This small, soft creature claims to be harmless, yet it appears at the moment of crucial negotiation. Perhaps our enemies have brought a new weapon disguised as weakness. The Elvari woman looked thoughtful as she studied Jake. She walked around the table with fluid grace that made her seem to float. Rather than walk, Jake stood very still as she approached, not wanting to do anything that might be considered threatening. Your species is unknown to our records. Human. You carry no weapons, bear no marks of allegiance, and show no signs of advanced technology. Yet you have somehow reached this neutral station during our most sensitive negotiations. She paused and tilted her head like a bird studying an interesting insect. Tell us. Human. Jake Martinez, why should we believe your tale of innocent navigation failure? Jake felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. The weight of all those alien stares was making him nervous, but he had always found that honesty was the best policy, even in strange situations. Ma'am, I can show you our ship logs and cargo manifest. We are carrying coffee beans, mining equipment, and some decorative crystals for a trade station in the Beta 7 system. Nothing dangerous or military, just regular commercial stuff. The mention of crystals caused another stir in the room. Several of the Elvari began speaking rapidly, while the Zephyrians made sounds that might have been laughter or threats. Jake could not tell which. The beautiful woman held up her hand again for silence. You speak of crystals. Human, what manner of crystals do you carry? Jake shrugged, not really sure of the technical details. They are just shiny rocks that people like to put in their offices and homes. Pretty, but not particularly valuable. We picked up about 3,000 pounds of them from a mining colony that was closing down. The silence that followed was so complete. Jake wondered if everyone in the room had stopped breathing. The Elvari woman swayed slightly, as if she might faint, while the large Sepharian warrior made a choking sound. 3,000 pounds, the woman whispered. You carry 3,000 pounds of crystals as decorative items. Jake nodded. Yes, ma'am. Is that a problem? The beautiful Elvari woman, whose name Jake learned, was Lady Solanas Moonwhisper, sat down heavily in her chair. Her violet eyes were wide with something that looked like shock, or maybe disbelief. The large Zephyrian warrior who had introduced himself as War Chief Thax, Andra made a sound like grinding metal, that Jake hoped was not Anger Lady. Solanas spoke in a voice that trembled slightly. Human Jake Martinez, do you understand what you have just revealed to us? These crystals you speak of, so casually are they perhaps translucent with inner light that pulses in rhythm with living beings? Jake thought about the cargo in his hold and nodded slowly. Yeah, that sounds about right. They are pretty neat actually. Some of them glow brighter when you touch them. The mining guy said something about resonance properties, but I did not pay much attention. War Chief Thaxandra stood up so quickly that his chair fell over backwards. The sound echoed through the great chamber like thunder as scales rippled with colors that Jake guessed meant strong emotion. For 3,000 cycles we have negotiated over the sacred resonance crystals of Nexus Prime, the very stones that power our homeworld and sustain our people, and this soft little human speaks of them as decorative baubles. Jake looked back and forth between the two alien leaders and felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Wait a minute, are you telling me that those crystals in my cargo hold are actually important to you people, lady? Solanas laughed, but it was not a happy sound. It was the kind of laugh someone makes when they realize the universe is playing a joke on them. Important human Jake Martinez, those crystals are the reason we have been at war for 3 millennia. My people need them for our longevity ceremonies and spiritual rituals. Without them we age and die like ordinary mortals. War Chief Thax, Andra pointed one massive clawed finger at Jake, while his eyes blazed with inner fire, and my people require them to power the atmospheric processors that keep our homeworld habitable. Without a steady supply of resonance crystals, our planet dies, and our species becomes extinct. Jake felt his mouth hanging open as he tried to process what he was hearing. So, you two have been fighting over crystals for 3,000 years, and I have been using them as paperweights and coffee cup holders. The silence that followed was broken by Lisa Harper, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange. She stepped forward and spoke in her calm, practical voice. Excuse me, but did Jake just say 3,000 years? That seems like a very long time to argue about anything. Lady Solanas turned her attention to Lisa and nodded gravely. Indeed, Captain Harper, the negotiations between our peoples have continued for exactly 2,847 standard years. We meet here at Harmony Edge every solar cycle to discuss terms and conditions for sharing the crystal resources of Nexus Prime. Jake scratched his head and looked around the enormous negotiation chamber. You have been meeting here once a year for almost 3,000 years to talk about rocks, and you still have not worked anything out. War Chief Thaxandra made that grinding metal sound again, which Jake was beginning to think might be Zephyrian laughter. The negotiations follow ancient protocols. Human, there are proper procedures that must be observed, sacred rituals that cannot be violated, centuries of precedent that guide every word and gesture. Jake walked over to one of the chairs around the great table and sat down without asking permission. The action caused several gasps from both delegations, but he was too confused to worry about protocol. Look, I do not mean to be rude, but this sounds completely crazy to me. You have a problem that both sides need to solve. You have resources that could help both sides. Why not just work together and find a solution that makes everyone happy, lady? Solanas blinked several times as if Jake had just suggested something impossible. The crystals of Nexus Prime are finite, human. There are only so many deposits, and they regenerate slowly. Over centuries of careful study, we have determined that there are not enough crystals to meet both our needs fully. Jake leaned back in his chair and tried to think through the problem. That assumes you can only get crystals from one place, right? But what if there were other sources? What if these crystals were not as rare as you think? War Chief Thaxandra leaned forward with interest. Explain your meaning. Human Jake stood up and gestured toward the door. Well, like I said we have about 3,000 pounds of these crystals in our cargo hold right now, and this is just stuff we picked up from one little mining colony that was shutting down. They told us they had been pulling crystals like these out of the ground for 20 years, and barely made a dent in the available deposits. The two alien leaders exchanged glances that seemed to carry entire conversations. Lady Solanas spoke first. You are suggesting that these resonance crystals exist in abundance elsewhere in the galaxy? Jake nodded. That is exactly what I am suggesting. In human space, we have found crystal deposits on at least 12 different worlds. Most colonies use them for decorative purposes or simple energy storage. Nothing fancy or religious, just practical applications. Lisa Harper moved to stand beside Jake. She pulled out her tablet and began scrolling through shipping records. According to our cargo manifests, we have delivered similar crystals to 37 different stations and colonies in the past 2 years. The prices are pretty reasonable to nothing like what you would expect for rare materials war. Chief Thax, Andra sat down slowly, as if his legs had suddenly become weak. You speak of abundance, where we have known only scarcity. You describe casual use, where we have practiced careful rationing for 3,000 years. We have assumed that Nexus Prime held the only significant deposits in known space. Jake looked around the room and saw expressions of shock, confusion, and something that might have been hope on many faces. I think maybe you folks have been so focused on fighting over one source that you never looked for alternatives in human business. We call that tunnel vision. Lady Solanas stood and began pacing around the table. Her flowing robes created patterns in the air that were mesmerizing to watch. Even if what you say is true, human, the ancient laws governing our negotiations cannot simply be set aside. There are protocols that have been established over centuries, religious and cultural considerations that prevent rapid change. Watched her pace and tried to understand why anyone would choose to make things more complicated than necessary. Ma'am, with respect, it sounds like you are letting rules get in the way of solving your actual problem. Why not just try something different? For once, the question seemed to hit both alien leaders like a physical blow. War Chief Thaxandra made several sounds that might have been words in his native language, while Lady Solanas stopped pacing and stared at Jake as if he had just suggested they all jump off the station without spacesuits. Try something different, Lady Solanas repeated slowly. Human, these protocols exist for sacred reasons. They maintain the balance between our peoples and ensure that neither side gains unfair advantage over the other. Jake shrugged. That makes sense if you are fighting over limited resources. But if there are plenty of resources for everyone, then you do not need to fight at all. You just need to figure out fair ways to share the abundance. Lisa Harper looked up from her tablet. Jake is right. You know, the basic economics here are simple. If supply increases dramatically, then scarcity becomes cooperation. Everyone can get what they need without taking from someone else. War Chief Thax, Andra turned his burning gaze on Lisa. Captain Harper, you speak of economics as if they override honor and tradition. My people have spent generations preparing for this conflict. Training warriors, developing strategies, building weapons. What would you have us do with all that preparation? Jake thought about that for a moment. Well, what if, instead of preparing to fight each other, you prepared to work together? Mining operations need security, right? Exploration requires both technical skill and protection. Maybe your warriors could help guard the mining sites, while the Elvari provide the technical expertise for crystal harvesting. The idea seemed to create a buzz of conversation around the room. Representatives from both sides began talking quietly among themselves in their native languages. Jake could not understand the words, but the tone suggested they were actually considering his suggestion. Lady Solanas returned to her seat and fixed Jake with her violet stare. Human, your suggestions have merit, but they ignore 3,000 years of mistrust and conflict. Even if resources exist elsewhere, how can we trust each other enough to work together? Our peoples have been enemies for so long that cooperation seems impossible. Jake leaned forward across the table and met her gaze. Trust has to start somewhere, and it usually starts with small steps. What if we organized a simple test, a trial run to see if cooperation actually works better than competition? War Chief Faxandra crossed his massive arms over his chest. What manner of test do you propose? Humanjik smiled for the first time since entering the chamber. Well, first how about we all grab some coffee and talk this through, like reasonable people, instead of sitting in this formal setting. Why not just have a normal conversation? I bet once you start talking to each other as individuals, instead of as representatives, you will find you have more in common than you think. Jake led the group of alien diplomats down the corridor toward his ship while trying to explain. Human coffee culture Lady Solanas walked beside him with graceful steps that made no sound while War Chief Daxandra followed behind, making the floor vibrate with each footfall. Lisa Harper brought up the rear, keeping an eye on the various other alien delegates who had decided to join this unusual expedition. The thing about coffee, Jake was saying, is that it helps people think more clearly and makes conversations more relaxed. Back on Earth, we settle most of our business deals over coffee or beer. Coffee for morning meetings, beer for evening ones. Lady Solanas tilted her head in that bird-like way she had when something confused her. Your species alters its mental state with chemical substances before making important decisions. Does this not impair judgment? Jake laughed. Not really. It just helps people relax and be more honest with each other. When you are sitting around a table, sharing drinks, you stop thinking of the other person as an enemy and start thinking of them as just another person with problems to solve. The docking bay seemed much smaller now, with 8-foot-tall Zephyrian warriors and flowing robed elves filling the space. Jake felt a moment of embarrassment as he looked at his humble cargo ship next to the elegant vessels the aliens had arrived in. The New Dawn was purely functional, with dents and scratches that told the story of years hauling cargo through dangerous space. This is your vessel? War Chief Thaxandra asked as he examined the ship with obvious curiosity. It appears to have survived many battles. Jake patted the hull affectionately. Not battles exactly, more like accidents and bad weather. We are traders, not warriors. This old girl has gotten us through some tough situations, but we try to avoid fighting whenever possible. One of the Elvari delegates, a stern-looking woman with silver-braided hair, spoke up for the first time. Your species avoids conflict. How then do you resolve disputes and maintain order? Lisa Harper answered while activating the cargo ramp. We try talking first. Most problems can be solved if people just sit down and explain what they actually need instead of what they think they want. Fighting is expensive and usually makes everyone worse off. The cargo hold of the New Dawn was packed with containers labeled in basic human script. Jake led the group to a section near the back where several large crates were stacked. The labels read Decorative Crystals Mining Colony, Zeta 12 clearance sale. Jake used a crowbar to open the nearest crate, and the aliens gathered around to see inside. The container was filled with crystals of various sizes, from small gems that fit in the palm of a hand to larger specimens the size of a human head. They glowed with soft inner light that pulsed in slow rhythms. Lady Solanas reached out with trembling fingers to touch one of the larger crystals. The moment her skin made contact, the stone blazed with brilliant violet light that matched her eyes. She gasped and pulled her hand back as if burned. By the sacred stars, these are pure resonance crystals of the highest quality. War Chief Thaxandra leaned over the crate, and his cybernetic implants began blinking in response to the crystal energy. The harmonic frequency is perfect. These stones could power our atmospheric processors for decades. Without degradation, Jake watched their reactions with growing understanding. So these really are the same crystals you have been fighting over. And you are telling me they are actually valuable? Lady Solanas turned to face him with an expression of wonder and disbelief. Human Jake Martinez, do you understand what you have shown us? This single container holds more resonance crystals than my people have gathered in the past century. Jake walked over to another crate and opened it, revealing even more crystals. Well, we have 5 more containers just like this one, Plus the mining guys gave us contact information for 6 other colonies that have similar deposits. They said crystal mining is pretty common in human space because the stones are useful, but not exactly precious. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of War Chief Thax Andra sitting down heavily on a nearby cargo container. His massive frame made the metal creak in protest. For 3,000 years my people have scraped and fought for every crystal fragment, while your species treats them as common trade. Goods. Lisa Harper pulled out her tablet again and began running calculations. According to the market data, I can access the total value of crystals in our cargo hold at current human prices would be about 12,000 credits. That is a decent profit, but nothing special. Maybe enough to upgrade our navigation system. Lady Solanas made a sound that might have been laughter or crying. 12,000 credits, Captain Harper. A single crystal of this quality would be worth more than the gross planetary product of most worlds in our empire. Jake frowned as he tried to understand the economic implications. Wait, so you are saying these crystals are incredibly valuable in your part of space, but cheap and common in human space? That does not make sense. Unless War Chief Thaxandra finished the thought. Unless crystal formation requires specific stellar and geological conditions that exist in human territory, but not in ours. The galaxy is vast. Human. There is no reason to assume that resource distribution would be uniform. Jake snapped his fingers as understanding dawned. That is it exactly. You folks have been fighting over limited local resources when there are unlimited resources just a few sectors away. It is like two people fighting over the last apple while standing next to an orchard. One of the younger Elvari delegates stepped forward with excitement in her voice. If human Jake Martinez speaks truth, then both our peoples could have all the crystals we need. There would be no scarcity, no need for conflict, no reason to continue this ancient war. Lady Solanas held up a hand for caution, but such abundance would require trust, cooperation, and trade agreements with this unknown human species. What guarantee do we have that they would deal fairly with us? What if they demand impossible prices once they understand the true value of their crystals? Jake looked at her with genuine confusion. Why would we want to cheat you? Honest business relationships last longer and make more money over time than trying to trick people. Besides, if you become our customers, then we both benefit. You get the crystals you need, and we get steady income from supplying them more. Chief Thax Andra stood up and began pacing around the cargo hold, his heavy footsteps echoing off the metal walls. Your species thinks in terms of mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. This is unusual in our experience. Most conflicts arise because one side can only win if the other side loses. Jake shrugged. That is true sometimes, but it does not have to be the default approach. Look at this situation. You need crystals for spiritual reasons and planetary survival. The Elvari need them for longevity and cultural practices. Human miners need customers for their products. Everyone gets what they want if we just organize the trade properly. Lisa Harper looked up from her calculations. Jake, the numbers work out really well if we could establish regular trade routes between human crystal mining operations and Elvari and Zephyrian territories. We could probably supply both empires for centuries without exhausting the available deposits. Lady Solanas walked slowly around the open crate, trailing her fingers along the crystal edges. Each stone responded to her touch with pulses of colored light, creating a display that was beautiful beyond description. But even if such trade were possible, the cultural and religious barriers remain. Our peoples have defined themselves through this conflict for thousands of years. Jake watched the light show and had an idea. What if the conflict became cooperation instead? What if instead of being ancient enemies, you became the galaxy? Most successful business partners think about it. You have thousands of years of experience working together, even if it was as opponents. You understand each other better than any other species. War Chief Thax Andra stopped pacing and looked thoughtful. You suggest that our long history of conflict has actually prepared us for cooperation? Jake nodded. Exactly. You know each other's strengths and weaknesses. You have developed communication protocols and neutral meeting spaces. You have systems for negotiation and dispute resolution. All the infrastructure for a partnership already exists. You just need to change the goal from defeating each other to helping each other. The group fell silent as they considered this idea. Jake could see various emotions playing across the alien faces: hope, fear, excitement, and deep thought. The crystals continued to pulse with gentle light, as if responding to the emotional energy in the room. Finally, Lady Solanas spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Human Jake Martinez, you have shown us abundance, where we saw scarcity, cooperation, where we saw only conflict, possibility, where we saw only ancient limitations. But changing the course of 3,000 years will not be simple. Jake smiled and closed. The crystal crate am nothing worthwhile is ever simple, but sometimes the best solutions are the ones that seem too obvious to work. How about we start with something small and see how it goes? War Chief Thax. Andra crossed his arms and fixed Jake with a steady stare. What do you propose? Human Jake looked around at the assembled aliens and felt a strange sense of destiny settling over him. Well, first we need to prove that regular crystal trade is actually possible. Why do not we organize a test shipment? Send some crystals to both your homeworlds and see if they work as well as the ones from Nexus Prime. If they do, then we know the solution is reality. Solanas nodded slowly. That would indeed be a logical first step, but what of the political and cultural obstacles? How do we overcome 3 millennia of mistrust and hostility? Jake grinned. That is where the coffee comes in. The emergency session that followed Jake Coffee's suggestion brought representatives from both empires, who had not been present for the original negotiations. Elder council members from the Elveria arrived in ships that looked like they were made of condensed starlight, while Zephyrian warlords came in vessels bristling with weapons and armor. Jake stood in the center of the great chamber, feeling very small, as dozens of alien dignitaries argued in languages he could not understand. The beautiful harmonics of Elvari speech clashed with the grinding bass tones of Zephyrian debate, creating a cacophony that made his head hurt. Lady Solanas tried to maintain order, but Jake could see the strain on her face as conservative members of her own delegation questioned every word she spoke. An elderly elf with robes that seemed to contain actual galaxies pointed a long finger at Jake and spoke in heavily accented human language. This creature appears at the moment of greatest delicacy in our negotiations, bearing tales of abundance that sound too convenient to be true. How do we know this is not some elaborate deception by our enemy's war chief? Thaxandra stood to defend Jake, but before he could speak, one of the largest Zephyrians Jake had ever seen slammed a massive fist on the table. The sound echoed like thunder through the chamber. The soft humans arrive precisely when we are closest to breakthrough in our righteous cause. This cannot be coincidence. They seek to deny us our destined victory over the crystal thieves. Jake looked at Lisa Harper, who shrugged helplessly. This was getting out of hand fast. The simple solution he had proposed was being buried under centuries of mistrust and political maneuvering. War Chief Thaxandra and Lady Solanas found themselves in the unusual position of defending the same viewpoint against their own people. Jake watched as they tried to explain the potential benefits of cooperation, while their respective councils demanded they return to traditional methods. The argument continued for hours, with delegates shouting over each other and threatening to walk out. Jake finally had enough. He stood up on his chair to get everyone attention and whistled as loudly as he could. The shrill sound cut through the alien voices like a knife, bringing sudden silence to the chamber. Every eye in the room focused on Jake as he looked around at the assembled dignitaries. Excuse me, he called out, but this is exactly the kind of thinking that has kept you folks fighting for 3,000 years. You are so busy arguing about who might be trying to trick whom that you are not even willing to test whether a solution might actually work. Elder council member, whose robes contained what looked like miniature supernovas, spoke in a voice like crystalline bells ringing. Human creature, you do not understand the complexities involved. There are sacred protocols that cannot be violated, ancient promises that must be honored. Jake jumped down from his chair and walked over to the Elvar Elder respectfully, Ma, I understand that traditions are important. But when traditions stop you from solving problems, maybe it is time to think about new traditions. The giant Zephyrian, who had objected earlier, growled deep in his throat. Humans speak easily of abandoning honor, but my ancestors died fighting for these crystals. Their sacrifice demands that we continue the struggle until victory is achieved. Jake turned to face the Zephyrian warrior. Sir, I respect your ancestors and their sacrifices, but would not the best way to honor them be to make sure no more Zephyrians have to die for crystals? What if instead of victory through conquest you achieved victory through abundance? Lady Solanas stepped forward to support Jake, but before she could speak, alarms began blaring throughout the station. The smooth mechanical voice of the station AI announced emergency diplomatic protocols activated. Multiple military vessels approaching from both Elvari and Zephyrian territories. War Chief Thax, Andra snarled as he activated a communication device. Fleet Commander, report your position and intentions. A harsh voice crackled through the speaker. War Chief, we have received reports that you are being deceived by enemy agents. We are moving to extract you from this obvious trap. Lady Solanas activated her own communication system as graceful ships appeared on the station view screens. Elvari Command, why have you violated the neutral zone? A musical voice responded. Lady Solanas, intelligence sources indicate that Zephyrian forces are using unknown aliens to gain advantage in negotiations. We cannot allow such treachery to succeed. Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized the situation was spiraling completely out of control. Both sides were sending military forces to rescue their negotiators from what they saw as enemy deception. The very solution he had proposed was being interpreted as an act of war. Lisa Harper moved to Jake's side and spoke quietly. We should probably get back to our ship, Jake. This is about to become very dangerous. But Jake was looking at the faces around him. Lady Solanas appeared torn between duty to her people and the possibility of peace. War Chief Thaxandra was clearly struggling with similar conflicts. The moderate delegates from both sides looked frightened, while the conservatives seemed almost pleased that events were proving their suspicions correct. Jake made a decision that would later be remembered throughout the galaxy. He walked to the center of the room and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. Stop. He called out. Everyone just stop for 1 minute. The authority in his voice was so unexpected that even the alien military commanders fell silent. Jake looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as he could. You are all about to throw away the best chance for peace you have had in 3,000 years because you are afraid of being fooled, but the only people fooling you are yourselves. He gestured toward the view screens, showing the approaching fleets. Look at what you are doing. You have proof that crystal abundance exists. You have a practical solution that could benefit everyone, but instead of testing it, you are choosing to fight about it. Lady Solanas stepped forward with tears in her violet eyes. Human Jake Martinez, even if what you say is true, how can we overcome 3 millennia of conditioning? Our peoples have been taught from birth that the other side cannot be trusted. Walked over to her, and then to War Chief Thax Andra, bringing them face to face. You start by choosing to trust right now, today. In front of everyone. Lady Solanas, do you personally believe that War Chief Thax Andra wants what is best for his people? She looked into the burning eyes of the massive Zephyrian and spoke slowly. Yes, I believe he does. Jake turned to the War Chief. Do you believe that Lady Solanas wants what is best for her people? The Zephyrian warrior studied the elegant Elvari diplomat for a long moment before nodding. She has always negotiated with honor, even when we disagreed. Jake spread his arms wide. Then you both want the same thing. You want your people to be safe, happy, and prosperous. The only question is whether you want to achieve that through conflict or cooperation. The approaching fleets were getting closer, and Jake knew he was running out of time. He pulled out his communicator and contacted Lisa Harper on the ship. Lisa, he called, prepare to transfer 1 container of crystals to Lady Solanas' ship and another to War Chief Thaxandra's ship right now. But Jake, Lisa protested. If those crystals are as valuable as they think, Jake cut her off. That is exactly why we need to do this. We are going to prove that humans deal in good faith by giving them samples to test. Take the crystals to their homeworlds, verify that they work, and then decide whether you want to trust us with a larger trade agreement. The gesture sent shockwaves through both delegations. Jake was offering to give away what they now knew were incredibly valuable resources, without any guarantee of payment or return war. Chief Thaxandra stared at Jake as if he had grown a second head. You would trust us with such wealth before any agreement? Sinjik nodded. That is how trust works, sir. Someone has to take the first risk. Lady Solanas' voice was barely a whisper. But what if we simply take the crystals and refuse to honor any future agreements? What prevents us from stealing from you? Jake smiled at her. Because that would be short-sighted, and you folks are clearly too smart for that. If you steal from us once, you lose access to unlimited crystals forever, but if you deal fairly with us, you can have steady crystal supplies for thousands of years. The conservative factions from both sides began protesting loudly, but Jake held up his hand for silence. Here is my proposal, he announced. Take sample crystals to your homeworlds, test them thoroughly. If they work as well as your local crystals, then meet me back here in 30 days. If you decide you want to establish regular trade, we will negotiate fair prices and delivery schedules. If you decide you do not trust humans enough to do business with us, then keep the samples as gifts and go back to fighting over Nexus Prime War Chief Thaxandra and Lady Solanas looked at each other across 3,000 years of conflict and mistrust. Jake could see the moment when they both made the same decision. Lady Solanas spoke first. War Chief Thaxandra, I propose we accept this human test and evaluate the results. Honestly, the massive Zephyrian nodded slowly. Lady Solanas, I agree. If Jake Martinez's crystals prove genuine, then we will have much to discuss. Jake felt a grin spreading across his face as he watched history being made. Now, this is what I call progressed. 28 days later, Jake sat in the observation deck of Harmony Edge Station, watching ships arrive from across the galaxy. The Elvari delegation came in vessels that looked like crystalline flowers blooming in space, while the Zephyrian fleet approached in formations that spoke of discipline and power. But something was different this time. The ships were not taking defensive positions or maintaining careful distances. Instead, they were docking side by side in the same bays. Jake could see Elvari and Zephyrian personnel working together to unload equipment and supplies. Lady Solanas entered the observation deck first, moving with her usual fluid grace. But there was something new in her violet eyes, something that looked like joy. She was followed by War Chief Thaxandra, who seemed less imposing than before. His massive frame still commanded respect, but the aggressive tension was gone. Behind them came delegations from both empires, but also representatives from dozens of other species that Jake had never seen before. The galaxy had been watching the Nexus Prime negotiations for centuries, and news of a potential breakthrough had spread faster than light. Jake Martinez, Lady Solanas said, as she approached the human. The crystals from your cargo hold have been tested by our finest scientists and spiritual leaders. They are not only equivalent to Nexus Prime crystals, they are superior in many ways. The resonance frequency is more stable, the energy output is higher, and the harmonic patterns are more complex. War Chief Thaxandra nodded in agreement. Our atmospheric engineers report that a single container of your crystals could power our homeworld for 5 standard years. The abundance you described is real and verifiable. Jake stood up to greet them, feeling oddly formal after everything they had been through. So what happens now? Do you want to talk about trade agreements, lady? Solanas smiled, and it transformed her already beautiful face into something radiant. Jake Martinez, before we discuss trade, we must discuss something more important. Both our empires owe you a debt that cannot be measured in crystals or credits. War Chief Thaxandra stepped forward, and to Jake's amazement, the massive warrior knelt on one knee. Human, you have given us what 3,000 years of negotiation could not deliver. You have given us hope. Jake felt embarrassed by the gesture, and motioned for the war chief to stand up. Sir, You do not need to do that. I just pointed out what was already there. You folks did all the hard work of deciding to trust each other. A new voice spoke from behind them, and Jake turned to see a being unlike any he had encountered before. It was tall and ethereal, with skin that seemed to be made of liquid silver and eyes like galaxies. The creature wore robes that shifted color with each movement. I am Ambassador Zenith of the Galactic Mediation Council. The being said in a voice like solar wind, we have monitored the Nexus Prime conflict for 2 millennia, waiting for an opportunity to offer assistance. Your breakthrough has created that opportunity. Jake looked confused. Galactic Mediation Council. I have never heard of that. Ambassador Zenith smiled with an expression that was both alien and warm. We are a coalition of elder species that work to resolve conflicts between younger civilizations. Usually we must wait centuries for warring parties to become ready for peace. The speed of your success is unprecedented. Lady Solanas stepped closer to Jake Martinez. Your simple approach to our complex problem has attracted attention throughout the galaxy. 17 different conflicts have requested human mediation in the past 20 days. Jake sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Wait a minute, I am not a mediator. I am just a cargo hauler who got lost. All I did was suggest that people talk to each other instead of fighting. War Chief Thaxandra made the grinding sound that Jake now recognized as Cepharian laughter. Perhaps that is exactly why your approach works. Human. You see solutions where diplomats see only complications. Lisa Harper entered the observation deck, looking slightly overwhelmed. Jake, the communication system on our ship has been flooded with requests for crystal delivery services. We have enough orders to keep us busy for the next 50 years. Ambassador Zenith stepped forward. Captain Harper, the Galactic Mediation Council would like to offer your species associate membership. We believe humans have much to contribute to galactic peace. Jake looked around at the assembled aliens and felt a strange mix of pride and panic. This is all happening very fast. 3 weeks ago I had never heard of any of you, and now you want humans to become galactic peacekeepers. Solanas walked to the large window overlooking the docking bays, where Elvari and Zephorian ships were being loaded with crystal shipments. Jake Martinez, look at what has already been accomplished in 28 days. We have ended a 3,000-year war, established trade relationships that will benefit billions of beings, and created the foundation for lasting peace. Chief Thaxandra joined her at the window. The first joint Elvari Zephyrian mining expedition launches tomorrow to establish permanent crystal extraction facilities in human space. Our warriors and their scientists will work side by side for the first time in recorded history. Jake walked over to join them at the window and watched as Elvari technicians and Zephyrian engineers collaborated on loading procedures. It was a sight he never could have imagined a month ago. So what happens to the Nexus Prime crystals? Jake asked, since you do not need to fight over them anymore. Lady Solanas smiled. We have decided to leave them untouched and declare Nexus Prime a galactic heritage site. The world that witnessed our longest conflict will become a symbol of the peace that followed. Ambassador Zenith approached the group, carrying what looked like an official document. Jake Martinez, the Galactic Mediation Council, wishes to offer you the position of Chief Human Mediator with full diplomatic status and resources to establish human peacekeeping operations. Jake took the document and stared at it without really reading the words. A month ago, my biggest worry was whether our navigation system would get us to the right station. Now you want me to solve problems for the entire galaxy. War Chief Thaxandra placed a massive hand gently on Jake's shoulder. Human, your gift is not seeing problems as unsolvable. You see them as puzzles waiting for the right approach. The galaxy needs more of that kind of thinking. Lisa Harper moved to stand beside Jake. Jake, remember what you told me when we first started working together? You said that every problem is just an opportunity that has not been recognized yet. Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him, Elvari, Zephyrian, and species. He could not identify all. Looking at him with expressions of hope and expectation, he thought about his daughter back on Earth, and what she would say when he told her that Daddy had accidentally become a galactic peacekeeper. You know what he said, finally? If someone had told me a month ago that I would end a 3,000-year war before lunch, I would have suggested they get their head examined. But here we are. Lady Solanas laughed with genuine joy. Jake Martinez, you have taught us that the most complex problems sometimes have the simplest solutions. Jake grinned and looked out at the busy docking bays, where former enemies were working together. Well then, I guess we better get started on the next problem. The galaxy is not going to fix itself. War Chief Thax. Andra made his grinding laugh sound indeed human. But first we must celebrate. Today marks the official end of the Nexus Prime War and the beginning of the Alvari-Zephyrian Alliance. Zenith produced what looked like a bottle of liquid starlight. This is ceremonial wine from the first species to achieve galactic peace. It is traditional to share it when conflicts end. Jake accepted a glass of the glowing liquid and raised it toward. The window here is to solving problems instead of creating them, to cooperation instead of conflict, and to the crazy idea that talking things through might actually work. As they drank the ceremonial wine, Jake reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A broken navigation system had led him to the most important diplomatic breakthrough in galactic history, all because he had been too confused to follow proper protocol and too practical to accept that some problems could not be solved. Lady Solanas moved to stand beside him at the window. Jake Martinez, there is something else we must discuss. Jake looked at her expectantly. What is that? Lady Solanas smiled, with an expression that was both mysterious and amused. The Empire would like to commission a statue of you to be placed in our Hall of Heroes, but we are uncertain what pose would be most appropriate. Jake nearly choked on his ceremonial wine, a statue that seems like overkill for just pointing out the obvious. Chief Thax. Andra joined the conversation. The Zephyrian Coalition is planning a similar honor. We are thinking of depicting you holding a crystal in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. Jake looked back and forth between them. You are both serious about this statue thing? Lady Solanas nodded solemnly. It is important that future generations remember how peace was achieved. They must know that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the mightiest warriors, but from the most unexpected heroes. Jake sighed and looked out at the ships in the docking bay, where Alvari and Zephyrian crews were working together to load crystals for delivery across the galaxy. All right, he said, but I want the statue to show me doing something normal, like checking a shipping manifest or fixing a navigation system, because that is what I was actually doing when this whole thing started. Ambassador Zenith stepped forward. Jake Martinez, your story will be told throughout the galaxy for millennia. The human who solved the unsolvable simply by refusing to accept that it could not be solved. Jake raised his glass one more time. Here is two simple solutions, and the courage to try them. As the alien dignitaries raised their glasses, in response, Jake Martinez, former cargo hauler, an accidental galactic peacekeeper, looked out at the ships carrying hope and cooperation to worlds that had known only conflicted. Had been quite a lunch break.